Hello everyone, and thanks very much for joining us for the webinar today. In today's webinar, we're going to cover off 3 separate products, but we are going to show you those products working together. So the first product we're going to have a look at today is Document Management Link, which gives you the ability to store documents and view those documents within Sage 300. And then we'll have a look at the SOX check approval product, which puts an approval process around the entry and creation of your payments and checks. And lastly, we'll have a look at the electronic funds transfer product that will give you the ability to pay vendors electronically, receive money from your customers, and also pay employees electronically. So let's jump right ahead and we'll move on into Sage 300 to have a look at the product. So the first product we're going to have a look at today is the Orchid Document Management Link, and I'm going to show it working around accounts payable invoice entry. So important to note that we're not changing anything about the behavior of Sage 300. With Document Management Link, we're giving you the ability to store documents outside of Sage 300 and view them from within. So you notice there's an additional window that appears beside the Sage screen. If you're using multi-company and you're using the color coding, the Document Management Link window will mimic that color coding so that you can keep track of the documents for each company screen that you have open. You can also pin the window to the screen. You notice as I move the Sage 300 screen, the Document Management Link window moves with it. If I minimize the screen, then that Document Management Link window will minimize with it. So again, easier to keep track of the documents you're viewing against the screen. So for today's instance, I'm storing my documents in network folders. So on my C drive, I've got a folder that I named Orchid, and then I have a document folder, and then I have subfolders for the different types of documents that I'm storing. We're going to focus on the AP documents today, but it's important for me to note that the file structure for where you're storing documents would be unique to each customer. It's completely up to you how you configure these file folders to store documents, and really dependent on how you want to be viewing those documents throughout Sage 300. So in my case, for the AP documents, I'm storing those by vendor. So you see I have a folder here for my vendor 1200 and my vendor 1350. And when I open up the vendor 1200 folder, you'll notice that that's exactly what we're seeing here in the Document Management Link window. So the first configuration that's been done here is around the vendor number field. So we're linking documents to a field on the screen, and then based on the value in that field, it knows which documents to display in the Document Management Link window. If that value were to change to 1400, for example, then I would be viewing the documents related to the vendor 1400 in this screen. It will just dynamically update. Now, what I've done in the second configuration is you can configure up to 2 fields. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm storing the documents under that vendor number, so in the vendor folder, but I'm filtering what I'm seeing in this window based on the document number. So it's an easy way for me to be able to find the documents that relate specifically to this entry. So I've done a configuration around 2 screens. Now, when someone is entering a transaction and they want to store a document for that entry, you notice when I hover over the Document Management Link window, this Add button appears. By clicking that button, it takes me out into my environment where I can find a document that I'd like to attach and refile based on the file folders I've set up for Document Management Link. So in this case, you can see that I'm currently storing documents in a suspense folder. So I'm just going to click on a document and I can drag it and drop it over the Document Management Link window. And what's happened is it's refiled that document. So it's taken it from the suspense folder, and in this case, it's put it into my vendor 1200 folder. And you also notice that it renamed the document. So that's an optional configuration where I specified that I want to use the value in the document number field to rename the document. So an easy way to rename documents, if you scan a document, it's going to assign some random number. So this is an easy way for you to rename that document based on information on the Sage 300 screen. That is optional, though. You do not have to rename that if you don't want to. So if we now go back to my C drive, Orchid, documents, for my AP documents and my vendor 1200, there's the document that's been stored under my vendor 1200 folder. So that's how you can go about adding documents. You can add a document directly to a folder, and then it would be viewed through this window as well. So if you want to just directly file something into a file folder, the next time you open Document Management Link, you would see those documents here within the window. You also have the option to attach emails. So I could attach, let's just find one here. So there's one with an attachment. So I can drag and drop an email, and it will store it as a message file to be able to view that later on. This one has an attachment to it. I could also just drag the attachment and put the attachment in as well. And you notice it continues to rename these documents. If I were to try and drag another document, let's just say another PDF document, what will happen is the software recognizes that there's already a document that I've renamed with that file type. So a message will pop up to say, do you want to overwrite the document? Do you want to add a date parameter to it? Or you can add a -1. So you're not limited to the number of documents that you can attach here. And then I've got a configuration here around the purchase order number, and that's just another illustration. You can link documents to any field on any screen in any module of Sage 300 and any third-party product that's installed in your Sage environment. So you're going to see that working today with the TaiRox check approval product. So any SDK product you can use Document Management Link for. And in this case, what would have happened is an attachment would be done at the purchase order entry, and then I can choose to view those documents here around the AP invoice entry. So you can link documents to a field and specify that you want to see those documents against all screens where that field appears, or you can limit to a screen and you can just view documents against a particular screen if you so choose. And at the bottom is an illustration where I've linked documents to the entry grid as well. So again, you can link documents to any field, including fields within the entry grid. The only limitation you have is you cannot link documents to a checkbox field or a drop-down list. Some of the screens have a drop-down list option, so you can't link documents to a drop-down list. But any other field, open field on the screen, you can link documents to. You may notice this green box. That's actually the notes product from Orchid, where you can link freeform notes to any field on any screen in any module. But we're not covering that product today. I just wanted to mention why that window is there. So this product falls under what we call Information Manager. And that's where you would come to do the configuration for Information Manager. So I'm not going to go too far into it, but just to give you an idea, it's quite a simple product to be configured. So if we have a look at the vendor document number as an example, basically what you're going to be doing is if you want to isolate documents to a particular screen, then you can put in a roto ID. Which will isolate the documents, and you'll only view them against the screen that's specified in this roto ID field. For those of you not familiar with roto IDs, every screen in Sage 300 has a number associated with it. And we'll give you a tool where you can go to any screen, click in a field, and it will give you the roto ID and the correct field name for you to be configuring against. And then you're going to specify the fields that you want to link documents to. So in my case, I was storing documents under the vendor number and then filtering those documents based on the document number. And then you're going to put in a file path to where you're storing those documents. So in my case, my C drive, the Orchid folder, the document folder, the AP documents, and then I've got a curly bracket value here in the file path, which represents the vendor number. By doing that, if I store a document through the document management link window that does not currently have a folder, then document management link can create that folder and then file the document. So in this case, I'm saying use the vendor number to create that folder. And then when I renamed the document, I specified that I wanted to use value 2, which was the document number, and that's how it knew how to rename that file. So that's the overview of Document Management Link. Now we're going to move over and have a look at how Document Management Link works with the TaiRox Check Approval product. So TaiRox Check Approval is going to install just like any module within Sage 300, and we'll have a look at the setup. Again, it's a simple product for you to install and get running against your Sage 300 accounts payable payment entry. So with the check approval, we're forcing an approval process around the creation of checks and payment to the vendors. So what we're doing is the approval console is actually outside of Sage 300. So users doing the approvals do not need to log into Sage 300. They can access the approval console from their start menu. So if you have approvers responsible that aren't familiar with Sage 300, there's no concern there. They'll be able to do the approvals through this external approval console. And it's just a SQL instance. So we're going to put a link to that SQL instance and call the database approval or something of that fashion. And once you get that set up, you can just test the connection to make sure that the approval console is viewing that SQL instance. We have to validate a user. When the payment batch gets submitted for approval, it locks the batch in Sage 300. So once it's been submitted for approval, you can't make changes to it. But as soon as the approval takes place in the approval console, there's a process that'll run in the background automatically that will update the status of the batch and release it so that it can be posted. So we need to set up a user ID with the correct rights within Sage 300 to be able to do that in the background. So that's where an intermittent use of a LAN pack would be. But we haven't had anyone that's run into any problems in that regard because it's just a very quick update. You have the ability to send email notifications through the approval process. So you can set up your SMTP information here. And then you have some options in terms of the workflows that you can do for the approvals. You can have up to 3 levels of approval. So you could say all checks need to be approved at all levels, meaning it's going to go through level 1, through level 2, and through level 3. You can say that it only needs to be approved by users at higher levels, which is what we're going to have a look at today. In this case, what's going to happen is in my level 1 general manager has a limit up to $2,000. So anything below $2,000 is going to go to the general manager for approval. And then anything over $2,000 will actually skip the general manager and go to the controller for approval. So basically, based on the value, it will determine who it needs to go to for approval versus in the first instance, it would go to the general manager every time and then also to the controller. So you have some options there. You could also create a group of users and specify how many members of that group, up to 3, how many members of that group need to review and approve something. So you have some flexibility. You can set these dollar value thresholds as well, and you can specify 1, 2, or 3 levels of approval. A few other options. In my case, I've got it set where Anything that's under $500 doesn't require approval. So what will happen is it will go into the approval console as approved already. And then anything that the person needs to review will be sitting there as unapproved, and they'll activate a tick box to specify the ones that they're going to approve. Now, you do have an option to decline, so you don't have to approve everything. What will happen is it will remove that from that payment batch to allow the rest of the payments to go through. And I've got mine set up that anything that's not approved automatically create a new batch for those, so they don't need to be re-entered. If you don't activate that feature, it's just going to remove that payment from the payment batch, and then you're going to create that payment later on when you're ready to actually process that payment. You can choose which types of payments are getting approved. So this is based on your accounts payable settings. So I've just got checks that are being approved, but you could choose other payment types if you want to get those approved as well. And likewise, you can exclude certain payment codes from being approved. So you have some flexibility as to what exactly is getting approved. And then the data tab is just going to show you previous batches that have run. So you could come here if you wanted to have a look at any previous batches and what happened with those batches. And the database tab is just creating the approval console. So you'll basically create the SQL instance, and then within this setup window, you just come and hit this create button, and it's going to create that external approval console for you. So a fairly simple product for you to get set up. So when we come up to the AP transactions, I'm going to actually start at the invoice batch just so you can see that we're not changing anything about the behavior of Sage 300. We're just putting some controls in place. So I've got this batch here that I've created just to save some time today. And I want to show you what we've done here. So I've got an entry. The first entry is under $500. So with that entry, we'll expect that to go into the general manager's approval console as approved. So we've got that set up, and you notice here that I have the document management link window appearing. So the vendor 1400, if you recall, there was no folder for vendor 1400. So we'll just go back here to the Orchid documents, AP documents, and you see here there's no folder set up for my vendor 1400. So I mentioned earlier that Document Management Link can automatically create folders for you when you're storing a document. So for this particular entry, for my document under 500, I'm going to go ahead and add, and we'll drag in a document, and it's renamed it to the under 500 based on the value. And now if I close this window, we'll close right out of here and let's go back in. You'll see that it's created the folder for my vendor 1400 and it's filed that document in. So you can see here it's appearing here under the vendor 1400. I've been going the long way through my File Explorer just to show you that I was going back to the same place every time. But you can get directly to documents that are linked in the window by clicking the top button. I'll see all of the configurations against this screen. So if we go to the vendor number folder and we back up here, you'll see that it's added that vendor 1400 and then it's filed the document into that folder. So another feature for Document Management Link. So we've got the first entry here under 500. So we'll expect that to go to the general manager directly, and it will come into the approval console as approved. And then we have an entry that's under $2,000. So this will be where we're expecting that document to go to our general manager for approval because it's under $2,000. We'll add a document there. And then I've got another entry that's over $2,000. So we'll expect this one to skip the general manager and go directly to the controller for approval. And we'll add a document there. And then lastly, we've got an additional entry that's over $2,000 that we'll go ahead and decline so that you can see what that process looks like. And so that one, because it's over $2,000, will go to the controller, but we'll decline that when it gets into the approval console so that you can see how that process will work. So nothing different about the way I've created these these invoices in Sage 300. So we'll go ahead and let's post this invoice batch. And now we'll go over to create our payment entry. So again, nothing different about the screen that you're going to see here, but you notice there's an extra button down here at the bottom. So let's create a new payment batch. And we'll call it March 23, 2023. There we go. And so the first entry is going to be the one that's under $500. And that is for our vendor 1400. And then let's fetch the invoices here. So we've got, the under 500 is here. So you notice I'm seeing the documents from the document management link window. So even though this configuration is in the entry grid, you can configure it so that the document that you attached in accounts payable will appear here against the payment entry screen. So that's an example of document management link working against another screen within Sage 300 and how you can store those documents once and view them against other screens. So we'll go ahead and add this payment entry. This is just something about our remit to location, so not something we're interested in. And then the next entry was under 2,000. And again, that's for our vendor 1400. And let's go ahead and grab there's the under 2,000. So we'll say yes, and we'll add that to our payment batch. And then we had over 2,000 that's going to go to our our controller for approval. So let's grab that one. Over 2,000. And then finally, we had another one that's over 2,000, and we're going to decline that one for our vendor 1400. And there's one to decline, so we'll add that. Okay, so nothing different about the way I've created those payments, and you saw the documents appearing against the document management link window. So now if I were to try to print the checks or post the batch, I'm going to get this message saying it hasn't been approved. So you don't have the ability to print checks or post the batch until approval takes place. And so what I have to do here is submit this for approval. Am I sure? Yes. And off it goes to go out for approval. And it's telling me here that it sent an email notification to the person responsible for doing the approval. And the button will dynamically change to an in progress status. So anyone else coming into this screen is going to see that that payment batch is in the approval process. And you can actually click on that button and it'll show you the approval that's pending. So it'll list the invoices for me, show me who it was entered by, and it's sitting here waiting for approval. As it goes through the approval process, this will start to populate. So when the general manager approves, you'll be able to see that the general manager approved it and it's waiting for the next approval, as an example. So an email notification would have gone out to the general manager to let them know that there's an approval that's needed. So from my start menu, I can get to my approval console. Now this approval console, so we're going to say it's for our general manager. So you do have to set up the users in Sage 300 so we can validate the user ID signing into the approval console. But again, they don't need to sign into Sage 300 at all. Now, what you're seeing here is a tree view, and I'm seeing this for my TaiRox company. If you're running more than one Sage 300 company, and you have the same approvers for those companies, then you can send everything into the same approval console. So you can choose to have multiple companies going into the same approval console, and it'll be a tree view. So when I open up for TaiRox, I'm seeing the batches that are open for TaiRox. I could also, if I had another company here, then I would see that next company and I could open that and see the batches for that company. So you can use the approval console for a single company, or if you choose, you can use multi-company as well. So here's our batch for March 23rd. There's some information at the top that it'll give you the total of that batch, the batch number, the bank that it's drawn against, and who submitted it for approval. So I can see here it was submitted by the administrator. So as expected, the first payment, which was under $500, you notice here it came in with the check mark activated. So it's come into the approval console as approved. And then the second payment is the one that I need to actually review and approve. Now, we've also added an integration with Document Management Link. So typically Document Management Link only works inside Sage 300, but TaiRox has written an integration piece to give us the ability to see those documents within the approval console. So down here, as I click on a line in the approval at the top part, down here, I can see the document that's been attached. So I can view that document from within the approval console. When I click on the next payment, you'll see the document for that next payment is appearing. So it gives you the ability to view backup documents related to these payments without having to log into Sage 300. So we're going to go ahead and say, yes, we're going to approve that, save that, and then approve it. Am I sure? Yes, I am. So it's gone ahead and it's done the approval for this payment that's under $2,000, and it sent an email notification now to the controller to let the controller know that there's something that needs to be approved. So we'll go ahead and we'll log in now as the controller. Sorry, I left an L off that. And now we'll view that batch and we'll see the two payments that are over $2,000. So as expected, we're just seeing the ones that were over $2,000 based on our configuration of Document Management Link. So we'll go ahead, we're going to approve one and we're going to decline one. So when I go to save this, it's going to allow me then to approve it. So what we're going to expect to happen here is the first one is going to go through for approval. And the second one is going to be removed from the payment batch, and a new batch is going to be created with that payment in it. So the 2938 is going to be removed from our batch number 73. And we're going to see batch number 74 has automatically been created, and that payment has been entered into that batch. So I'll go ahead and approve. Now, what this message is saying is, because I've declined a payment, it's asking that I enter a comment as to why I'm declining that. So I'm just going to enter a comment here and say pay later. And then we'll go ahead and approve this. Sorry, save my comment and then approve it. Sorry about that. So now again, it's gone through and it's now notified the submitter. So the person that submitted the batch initially for approval, it's notified them to let them know the approvals have taken place on that batch, and you can now go ahead and process that batch. So when we go back into the payment batch, here's our initial batch 73 that is now sitting in an approved status. And as I mentioned, it's now updated to show me who did the approvals on this batch. And now I can go ahead and I can print that batch and print the check, sorry, and post the batch. So do I want to post it? Yes, I do. So it's now gone ahead and posted that batch. And then, as I mentioned, it created batch 74 for that 2938. So that's the payment that we that was over 2,000 that we declined. So it created that new batch. So once this payment batch has been posted, this is where you will then go over to EFT to create your EFT file to pay those vendors electronically. So this is where I'm going to pass it over to Rob.
Thanks, Nancy. That was a great overview of the TaiRox SOX check approval with Orchid Document Management Link. Now let's move along to EFT processing, or EFT processing for our American friends. As Nancy mentioned in her presentation, the SOX check approval solution allows you to approve payment batches before they can be posted. When the payment is going to be made via EFT, there are options that allow you to utilize the strength of the approval workflow that's part of TaiRox SOX check approval and incorporate that into the process of generating your EFT file. You do that by telling the system that you do not allow unposted batches to be selected. If you said yes, then the system would allow an unposted AP payment batch to be selected. And generally speaking, we don't believe this is a best practice, not only because of the approval that's not there, but because, as many of you know, you could make a change to an unposted AP payment batch, and there's no record of that change if a payment has already been created in EFT against those payments. So even when you're not using TaiRox SOX check approval, we generally recommend that you do not allow unposted batches to be selected for inclusion in an EFT file. It creates a better audit trail and better control around the payment process. But there are other factors to consider within EFT processing that help you manage and provide clean audit trails for your payments in EFT processing. One of those options is to skip the vendor and continue the creation of the EFT file. In this case, what we're suggesting is that you separate the payment batches between EFT and non-EFT vendors. This would mean that if you were combining both EFT and non-EFT vendors together, you would want to skip over the non-EFT vendors and generate the EFT file only against those vendors flagged as EFT. But we believe an even better way and a cleaner audit trail is to separate the EFT vendors from the non-EFT vendors and create two separate payment batches. Because when you have them together in one payment batch, you still have to process that payment batch twice, once for the printing and posting of check payments, and once for the processing of EFT payments. So if you choose to create two separate batches, you would display an error if you found a non-EFT vendor within the AP payment batch. And an easy way to do that is to use the create payment batch function to generate your payment batch. This includes criteria such as payment code. So if you defined a payment code for EFT or ACH payments, you could set that up against your vendors in the AP vendor master file. And this way on the processing page, you would use EFT as opposed to check payment code. And that means when you generated the create payment batch function, it would filter out any non-EFT vendor to be included in the batch, which means only EFT vendors would be part of that payment batch. The other thing that you can do, if you wish, is create a separate check number sequence for your EFT payments. Under the check stock tab in Bank within Common Services, you have the ability to create different check stock codes. And one of those check stock codes could refer to EFT payments that would use a different check form and a different series of check numbers. And this would allow you to have a unique series of EFT payment transaction documents versus check payment document numbers. And this would also then create a very nice clean audit trail for you. But in addition to audit trail considerations, we also need to consider, are there other ways to protect the sensitive information that you're working with when making payments to your vendors? And this is where things like encryption and passwords on the remittance advices come in. You can encrypt the vendor financial institution number, and you can also put passwords on remittance advices as well. And how do we establish that? Well, when you turn on the encryption, you'll notice that when we generate an EFT advice, we have the ability to X out the information for a particular type of payment transaction. So as an example, when I print the crystal form for the remittance advice, you will see how the vendor information for financial institution number is going to be X'd out on the form, so that that account number, and BSB number is the Australian term, that's financial institution number in North America. Those are either X'd out or asterisked out. And this protects that sensitive information on the remittance advice. And these remittance advice forms are standard crystal forms that come with EFT processing. And you can decide how much of this information you would like to include, and if you do include it, whether you would like it encrypted or not. So that's certainly one way that you can protect the information. Another way, though, is to email the remittance advice rather than print a hard copy and fold it, stuff it, and mail it through regular mail. Since you're already making payments electronically, it would make sense for you to send the remittance advice details electronically as well. And to do that, we specify a delivery method that says vendor or customer. When we're setting up our EFT vendors, we have the option to include an EFT vendor email address, which you see here, the email to line on the EFT vendor master file setup. But you also have the option to use the AP vendor delivery method, and that includes the email addresses that you can set up here, either as the contacts email or the straight email address. If you choose email, it uses the email address here on the address page. And if there's more than one email address, you can separate them with a semicolon and add an additional email address if you'd like. If you choose the contacts email, it would pick up the email address here on the contact page. So either way, whether you're using the contact email, the standard address email, or the EFT vendor email, either one of those email addresses is a valid email address to use. If EFT processing doesn't see an EFT vendor email address, it will automatically default to the AP vendor delivery method. And then once you've decided that you're going to use emails, then you can also configure the email message itself for payment transactions. And this can include the vendor contact details, date of payments, the list of documents with the invoice numbers being paid and the amounts, and the company name for your vendor. And this will streamline the process to make it more paperless, but also protect the sensitive information by having it emailed specifically to an individual that's nominated at your vendor to receive that information. And in addition to that, we can include a remittance advice password where you specify a password formula that allows only that designated person within the vendor to be able to open the remittance advice and see those sensitive details. So there's a multiple approach here to maintaining and controlling this sensitive information. But there are other ways within the security access rights of Sage 300 to determine who, how, and when these EFT payments get processed, and also how the EFT vendors themselves get set up. As we noted here within the EFT setup, there's an EFT vendor information that includes the banking details for that vendor. And this is obviously sensitive information. So one of the ways to protect that is using the security groups that come under administrative services of Sage 300. In these security groups, because EFT is written in the software development kit for Sage 300, it looks just like any other Sage module to the administrative services. So under security groups, you will see EFT as one of the options. And what we typically recommend to customers is that they create a segregation of duties to protect the sensitive vendor bank details. So we allow one person in the organization to view vendor EFT details and another one to approve those vendor bank account details. And when you create this segregation of duties within the admin services, you could also then create a segregation of duties around someone who can set up vendors but not actually generate the EFT vendor transaction itself by creating the file. So there's a couple of areas where you can introduce segregation of duties to protect that information. But even when you segregate who can enter versus view and approve the vendor details, it all comes down to the status. When we first set up the EFT vendor by using the status code, you could default to an entered status code, which again is one of the other options. The default vendor status can be set to entered, and using this in combination with the administrative services access right, an individual will only be able to enter the vendor details, but they won't be able to come over to the EFT vendor and change that status from entered to active. So here again is a segregation of duties around the setup of the vendors, where if you use the option to default to entered versus active, then the status would be entered when they're first set up, and a separate person will come in and open up the vendor, review the banking details, and change the status from entered to active. So this creates a nice control to approve your vendors without a formal workflow required. Of course, you could incorporate an extender workflow to formalize the process, to send an email alert and require an acknowledgement or an approval within an extender workflow to create the EFT vendor and or create the EFT file itself. There's a number of ways that we can incorporate extender to create more formal workflows in that way. But simply by using the setup option and the administrative services, you can create an effective audit control. And these are also recorded in the log that we provide with EFT processing. The log will show you every time a new vendor has been created within EFT with a date and a timestamp, the user within Sage 300 who set up that vendor, and the details of the banking information that was created against that vendor. And then as you can see here, it will track any changes to that information, and specifically in this case, the status against the vendor, where at some point someone will review the information that's been set up and then change the value from entered to active. And that will all be captured as part of the audit trail for the setup of that vendor. Likewise, there's a log here that keeps track of every time an EFT file has been created. So again, there's a unique EFT creation number with a date and a timestamp, the fact that it's an AP payment batch, the batch number that applies, the person who created the batch, the bank against which they created that batch, and where the EFT file is stored on the network prior to transmission to the bank, as well as the total dollar value of the transactions within that EFT file. So the system will be logging all of this information so that anyone can go back at any point in time and review the information that's been set up in EFT processing. But now, when we talk about the generation of the EFT file, we need to look at the different methods we can use to create these EFT files. Now, there are file types that are created for multiple banks and financial institutions all around the world. And while we can encrypt the banking information that's sent on the remittance advice, these EFT files are not encrypted unless we want to use a more advanced encryption type tool, or we want to put security around the domain for the folder or the file path where these EFT files are stored on the network. Now, this is where we might introduce domain controls in the Windows Active Directory services to restrict the access rights to certain individuals for the file path where these EFT files are stored. But another way that we can secure the file and ensure the integrity of the transaction details is, rather than create the file and have a separate process where we upload that file to the bank's website, we can incorporate SFTP, which is Secure File Transfer Protocol. And you can either use that with a password where you enter the host web server name, your user ID and password to log into the bank website, or with a key file, what some people call a token, where that key file or token is entered to authenticate who you are as the bank's customer, so that when the EFT file is generated, you don't need a second step to upload the file to the bank. Using SFTP, or the Secure File Transfer Protocol, as soon as the EFT file is created, the SFTP will move that file automatically to the bank website using the credentials that you've set up against that EFT bank. And this is a more efficient way to generate the file and send it to the bank all in one step. And you've got the security of knowing that as soon as that EFT file was created, it was sent to the bank, which eliminates any lag time between the time it's created and the time it's uploaded to the bank, which would minimize any opportunity for someone to modify that file. But of course, as you probably know, these EFT files are very strict in terms of the file layouts. And that's why when we create these file types, they're based on specifications that were given by the financial institution or bank. And even spaces are considered characters. So if any character, including spaces or punctuation, are out of alignment, you get an error message and the file is rejected. So it's very difficult in practice to modify or change an EFT file for payment details. And that's why some people consider using EFT processing as a way of avoiding check fraud and or identity theft that can be conducted on paper-based checks. This is a way for us to eliminate that possibility. And finally, in terms of audit capabilities or controls, if you generate the transfer details report within EFT, it will show you a list of all the payments that were included as part of an EFT file. And this is more of an environmental control where we can review the vendors who were paid, through which bank, whether the transmission was successful, the dollar value amount of the transaction, who created the EFT file, where it was stored, the total dollar value of the payment transactions, and the date and the timestamp. And this transfer details report can be matched against the posting journal for the AP payment batches and the report that you get back from your bank. And this will verify that the transactions that you created in accounts payable got approved and posted and then were sent to the bank in EFT are exactly the transactions that were processed by the bank. And so by comparing all three reports and matching to see that the details agree, you have some additional comfort that the transactions were processed appropriately and according to your specifications. So those are all the ways that we can incorporate security through encryption, segregation of duties, secure file transfer protocols, and the environmental control of matching report information after the fact. in addition to the audit logs that are logging when these payment transactions are being made through EFT and when and how EFT vendors are being set up to make electronic payments too. And this should give your customers some comfort that you can generate electronic payments in a safe, secure way within Sage 300 with a combination of TaiRox SOX check approval, Orchid document management link so that documents are there to support these transactions, and utilizing the EFT processing with these audit logs and controls to safely and securely generate EFT files rather than sending paper-based checks. So we hope you found this information useful. We appreciate your time today. Thanks so very much. If you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out at any time and let us know. Thank you very much.